I was actually a trumpet major about halfway through college, and realized that a lot of my friends who were graduating were getting out of school, not getting jobs because there aren't any, and they don't bother telling you that when you sign up. So I would come in as a freelancer and just kind of mix all these ancillary events. And it was awesome. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything about live sound. And so I just took what I had learned from studio production and pretended like the PA was just a really big set of studio monitors. I think the biggest thing that served me well was me being a musician first before I was a technician. 1,000 shows, 30 countries all over the world. Between Chris and Passion. Got to really be a part of those ministries in an up-close way that really kind of showed me a lot, not just about how to turn the knob and how to make a good mix, but the importance of partnering with the team on stage to lead worship. I got to have a front row seat to the greatest worship leader in the world in the heart of his career. I mean, how great is our God? Amazing Grace, my chains are gone. Your grace is enough. All those songs just being sort of a flame that would ignite modern worship in the church.
It's true.
It was really an honor to be able to help facilitate what they were trying to communicate.
Jeff Sandstrom, welcome to Churchfront Worship and Tech Podcast.
Man, thanks, Luke. It's great to be here.
Jeff, it's great to have you on the show. You've been a guest on our list for a long time, and really excited to have you on the show today. Why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us who you are, what you do, and what you're up to these days.
Sure. Well, my name's Jeff Sandstrom, and I have been an audio engineer for, going on 30 years now. I started in studios and then moved into live production through serving at my church, and grew from there to being out with some big artists that I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit, but transitioned from kind of touring full-time to being one of the co-founders of MXU. And MXU is designed to provide basically software training and tools to help church teams get better. So resources for audio, video, lighting, and leadership to help people serving in the local church have the tools that they need to not only get better at what they do, but to build a good team that's kind of working around the same heartbeat and vision for how we serve the church together. So that's kind of the 30,000 foot view. We can get a lot more specific as we need to, but I'm just glad to be here today.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. What's the season look like right now for you? I know sometimes you're on the road, sometimes you're filming content. So what are you up to right now?
Yeah. So right now I'm kind of actually winding down for the end of the year, which is a great feeling because it's been a really busy year. Back in the spring, it's funny. I've been telling people for years that I'm trying to come off the road from touring. And I've been telling my wife that for about 7 years. And I tend to get called for stuff, whether it's a fill-in or a short-term tour run or whatever. So earlier this year in the spring, I filled in for the spring run of Chris Tomlin's Stories of Worship tour, which was it was in churches rather than arenas. It was a real intimate evening with kind of thing where he would tell stories behind the songs and give some history behind how these songs came to be. And so from 2007 to 2016, I spent, almost 10 years on the road with Chris. So to be back out with those guys and to kind of get the band back together, so to speak, was an awesome thrill for me. I was filling in for his current front of house guy, a guy named Stephen Bailey, who a lot of people know through his work with Passion and Passion City Church and Waves, the plugins company. He was unable to do that tour in the spring due to a family medical emergency. And so I filled in for him, and it was great. That was about 24 shows. And so that kind of filled up the spring. And then in the summer, I was out with Dude Perfect as the audio engineer for their summer tour. And so again, it was just, friends had called me last year to see if I could do that. And I jumped on board with them. And so it was a great way to kind of spend the weekends of June and July. but it was a lot, a lot of travel. But my daughter got to be with me for a couple of those weeks, and so it was great. And then in the fall, we were gearing up for our big MXU Live event, which we finished in September. Mid-September, we were in Atlanta for 2 days doing a live, really, conference for MXU. And so as we come to the end of the year, I'm really looking forward to not being gone so much and just kind of winding things down. I have a couple of things here and there around Christmas. But other than that, I'm going to be home here in Greenville, South Carolina with my family and just trying to plan for next year. On the MXU front, in the middle of all that, we have done a lot of content filming for the platform. We hosted a couple of workshops in person at our headquarters in Knoxville. And so between all those things, it's been a really busy year. But for 2024, we've got a really great plan for our content recording for the MXU platform, and we're really excited to bring those resources to church teams who subscribe to our stuff. So can't wait to see what 2024 brings. But from now until then, looking forward to some rest and family time for the holidays. So
Yep. I hear that. And I would imagine, I think I follow you on social media where I'm imagining there's some golf games in the midst of that as well.
There's a little bit of golf. Yeah, actually I'm playing in a tournament this weekend with some buddies from my neighborhood. And yeah, golf is kind of my main hobby. So when I'm not doing MXU stuff and filming content or on the road with an event, then I'll have my golf clubs in my hand. But funny, over the summer I was able to play a lot of golf because I had the luxury of this summer being a pretty low key gig in terms of daily obligations. Like I didn't have to be at load in at 8 a.m. I didn't have to really do anything with, hanging or tuning the PA until the afternoon. So Rusty Anderson, who was the video director on that tour, and I would get up as soon as the bus got parked. We would get off the bus and go find a golf course and kind of spend the morning hitting the golf ball. So that was really fun. But
there's worse ways.
You never
to
know
spend
what you're going to get on a tour. Yeah,
That's right. Well, I want to hear, a little bit more about your background, because I know you've been in the industry for a great amount of time that has allowed you some of these amazing, not only on the road, but just, mixing opportunities. And you said you started in studio. What was the journey like, even getting into the studio world? What got you into that space, and kind of walk us through how that transitioned into live audio?
Sure. So I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor. Back then they called them ministers of music. They weren't worship leaders back then. It was, we were in a probably 200 to 300 person church with a choir and piano and organ. It was modern enough that we would sing some praise choruses mixed in with our hymns, but not so modern that we would integrate a modern band or drums or anything like that. So it was, my dad loved music and all kinds of music. So we would experiment with a few things, but instrumentation wise, it was pretty much just piano and organ. And then, so I grew up singing with my family. We would sing in church, and I just developed a love for music from an early age. So I went to college to study music. I was actually a trumpet major at the University of Michigan, and got to about halfway through college and realized that a lot of my friends who were graduating were getting out of school, not getting jobs because there aren't any, and they don't bother telling you that when you sign up. So I realized that I needed to find another area of interest in music where I might be able to make a living. So Michigan at the time was just starting a music technology program. They built a big recording studio and started offering classes in recording and MIDI production. And it was, the early stages of digital music production. In fact, digital audio was in its infancy. You could load tracks from a tape into a computer to basically do some like 2-track editing for a CD and getting tracks ready for replication. But in terms of recording, we were still recording to tape. So it was right at the beginning of that transition between analog and full digital production. So I was able to really learn a lot about analog in terms of signal flow And, my first cutting and pasting was with a razor blade and a piece of tape.
Wow.
So it was, it was daunting, but really impactful. I was learning a lot about mic placement and capturing the artist's intention behind what they were playing, realizing how much of a difference a microphone can make in terms of the signal, and really learning how to capture a performance well. So I got out of school and moved to Atlanta to start working in a recording studio in Atlanta, and spent a lot of time making records for people who didn't necessarily have the support of a record label. So it was maybe a custom artist who wanted to have a product to sell at their shows, kind of put some CDs in their trunk and sell them after the show. And they were mostly Christian artists, Christian, Southern gospel, Black gospel, Christian contemporary, whatever the genre, but it was all within Christian music. And got to work with some incredibly talented people and a few not so talented people. And that taught me a lot too, figuring out how to communicate. Man, that was really good, but let's get one more take. That was a phrase that I had to reuse over and over again. But at that studio, it was interesting. When you look back and you see how God kind of directs your steps, I'm so grateful, because the studio where I was happened to be the place that the team from North Point Community Church in Atlanta was using to produce their very first music tracks for their kids and students ministry. And I got to know the people who were behind all of the event production for what North Point was doing at the time. So anything that happened that wasn't on Sunday morning, so if it was a kids conference or a married adult retreat or a married Christmas big production, they would bring me in to mix for those events. The Sunday morning team was kind of on their own at that time, and they had their hands full with, service programming and producing all that needed to happen on the weekend. So I would come in as a freelancer and just kind of mix all these ancillary events. And it was awesome. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything about live sound. And so I just took what I had learned from studio production and pretended like the PA was just a really big set of studio monitors.
Right.
So things like EQ and dynamics processing and mic placement and all those things, I really tried to kind of translate as best I could into a live environment. The difference between the studio and live is, it's really hard sometimes to make things feed back in the studio. Not so much live. So I had to learn a lot about, mic technique for a vocalist, and EQ that I might use in the studio would have to be modified a little bit because some of those frequencies would just take off in a PA, especially if the singer's in front of the PA. So it was a lot of just kind of trial by fire and learning by doing and experimenting. But I think the biggest, I've told people this a lot, I think the biggest thing that served me well was me being a musician first before I was a technician. Mm-hmm. So I was able to develop kind of a library of sounds in my head that I wanted something to sound like, or, what is a good acoustic guitar supposed to sound like? What is a good snare drum sound like? What is the snare drum sound that I'm going for? And I was able to kind of develop this kind of muscle memory and audio memory of these are things that feel good to me, and how can I try to replicate that with whatever sound I'm dealing with. So if it's a guitar that doesn't have a microphone in front of it because it's using a pickup, how can I kind of take that boxiness that you get sometimes from the pickup and modify the tone such that it can sound more like a mic'd up guitar, that kind of thing. And so that's really kind of how I cut my teeth in live sound. And at the time, my time was spent really kind of 80% in the studio, 20% live. Okay. And then over those few years in the mid 2000s, because of North Point, I got to know a bunch of the team around Passion conferences, because before Passion City Church was a thing, most of the team from Passion attended North Point. Louis Giglio and Andy Stanley are kind of lifelong best friends. And so a lot of the team from Passion was a part of North Point. And so I volunteered for my first Passion conference in 2005 and have been a part of every one since. So
Wow.
this year will be the I guess 20th year of serving with Passion. In 2007, it was the first year that they had kind of a dual auditorium approach. They basically had filled up what was Phillips Arena at the time in Atlanta, now State Farm Arena. They had sold it out, but they had more demand, so they opened up for more seating, and they took over a big section of the Georgia World Congress Center and set up an auditorium in there. So they had basically a 7,000 seat overflow room.
Jeez.
And they piped the talk from whichever room was originating, and they had live worship in each room. So they asked me to mix the B room.
Okay.
And so that was by far the biggest thing I had ever been asked to do. And the arena was being mixed by Chris Tomlin's front of house guy at the time. So after the conference, I had met Chris and the guys, and, the artists for Passion at that time were Chris Tomlin, Charlie Hall, Matt Redman, and David Crowder. And so those four artists would rotate from auditorium to auditorium throughout the conference based on who was live in that session. And so I got to know all those teams and all those guys, and it was great. Well, shortly after, Chris approached me because the guy who was mixing for him at the time, Mark Thomas, had just taken a job as the monitor engineer at the Grand Ole Opry. And I think actually he's still there. So he's been in that role for 15 years.
Wow.
And so Chris asked me if I would come and take his place. And I said, man, I really appreciate it, but I'm doing great in the studio. My daughter was 9 months old at the time. I hadn't really thought about being a touring engineer, so thanks, but no thanks. And he said, well, why don't you come and fill in for some dates that we already have booked this spring and summer until we find somebody. And I said, okay, I'll do that. That'd be fine. And 9.5 years later, we finally found somebody. So I was, it was truly though, kind of the honor of my career to be able to be with Chris for all that time. And, literally 1,000 shows, 30 countries all over the world.
Jeez.
Between Chris and Passion, got to really be a part of those ministries in an up close way that really kind of showed me a lot, not just about how to turn the knob and how to make a good mix, but the importance of partnering with the team on stage to lead worship. I got to have a front row seat to the greatest worship leader in the world in the heart of his career. I mean, how great is our God?
Yep.
Amazing grace, my chains are gone. Your grace is enough. All those songs just being sort of a flame that would ignite modern worship in the church.
It's true.
It was really an honor to be able to help facilitate what they were trying to communicate. And so I really try to bring that spirit to everything that I do now, even mixing in my own church. It's like I want to partner with the team on stage to help facilitate this environment. So, that's really what led to the Heartbind MXU in a lot of ways, is how can we help teams in churches of all sizes and churches in all places be able to adopt not just best practices for training and equipping their volunteers, but developing a mindset in terms of the way those teams are led that says, our responsibility is to partner with the worship side to create environments that move people toward a step in their faith. And so it's way more than just how to turn the knob for me. And I think that distinction, the more we can advocate for that heart posture and that distinction, I think we're going to have better technicians, but we're also going to have, better leaders. And so it's a both and for me. And I think that started really way back in the day from the very beginning of North Point to moving toward working with Chris and other artists. It really has become kind of a part of who I am in a way that I hope is effective.
Worship leaders, production leaders, pastors, and volunteer teams. The Churchfront Conference is a 2-day conference created specifically for you. We bring in top shelf speakers from all around the country to speak on topics like worship tech, musicianship, theology, and leadership. At this event, you're going to be able to grow in your skill set as a worship or production leader, as well as connect with like-minded ministry leaders from all around the country who are just as passionate about serving their local church. Click the link to learn more and register your team today. I want to think back to when you were going to some of those fill-in shows and Chris was asking you to come on. Hey, just come in for a couple shows here. We've already got booked. Did you feel prepared at that point? I mean, you had already...
Not one bit.
So walk me through the first show. Like the first time that you go to a fill-in show, like what do you even remember it as? Like you've done so many these days that it would be hard to recall the exact thing, but I'm trying to think of, you'd done some kind of maybe auxiliary mixing for the church and studio work, and then you're asked to go on this tour. Is Chris big at this point? Is he in arenas yet, or is he in small stages? What was the situation?
He was big. Most of those first shows were like summer festivals where he was maybe the headliner of an event, but it wasn't a full arena like concert tour. Yeah. So the first, I think the first stuff I did was more of that kind of show, but it was still a 60-minute set, so it was a big deal. Yeah. The consoles that most festivals were speccing at the time were the Avid venue profile, and so I had developed a show file and a way of working that I was really comfortable with at church, because that's the format console that North Point had at the time, and so I was able to kind of transfer some of those best practices into Chris's show file. And one thing I loved about that console was it was the first console to use plugins as part of its workflow. Wow. And I had used a bunch of Waves plugins in the studio, so I was familiar with that approach. And so I was able to take some of those best practices and some of those presets even into the live environment, which was super helpful in terms of my comfortability, because I didn't feel like I was walking in blind. Now, there were some shows where I would walk up to front of house and it was a console that I hadn't used before. I remember we went to Europe for a couple of things, and they had a big old Midas desk that was like, I've never seen this thing before. So luckily there was a system tech who was able to kind of show me around and, help me get some of the inserts patched, because the inserts were all outboard. And, I was able to kind of hunt and peck a little bit until I could figure things out. But, in a festival setting, I think this may be important for somebody who's just starting out or just starting to figure out how they're going to lay things out or whatever. In a festival setting, it was a very linear kind of approach. Like, here's our patch sheet, here's our input list, and everything is kind of one-to-one on the console. So I wasn't doing really any group processing or any parallel processing. No, no like super weird tricks to kind of get in and out of the console. It was like, here's my drums starting with my kick, and we go down 10 channels, and then it's bass, and then keys, and then electrics, and then vocals. It was like, really basic. And so I was really kind of at the point where I would get EQ dialed in and then just manage faders. And, I think having that simple mindset, especially if you're working with, an unfamiliar environment or trying to get up to speed on some new technology, I think starting things in their simplest form, making sure that the source is good, making sure that the mic is in the right place, that's a really good place to start. And so for me, there was a little bit of trial by fire, but again, I knew what sounded good. I knew what I was going for in terms of the approach. And so I was just really trying to maximize whatever tools I had at my disposal to try to get that result. Now, I did have the advantage of knowing what EQ does, right. So I wasn't not like I didn't know how to EQ something. It just may look a little different on this desk than it did on the desk last week. But either way, it's like, okay, making a 3 dB cut at 400 hertz is going to do the same thing with Chris's acoustic on this desk than it did on that other desk. So let me figure out how to make that cut. That was kind of the thing. And then the first big tour that I did, we actually had Yamaha consoles. We had a PM5D for monitors in front of house. And so there was a bit of a learning curve getting used to that desk. And then later we went back to Profile, and then later we went to Digico. So
wow.
I've had experience over the years with changing platforms. And so that in and of itself is quite an exercise. But, I think honestly, the biggest thing that serves me in any environment, whether it was back then or now, is that approach from a musical standpoint before the technical. I think, having a picture of where the target is and how I can, like, what do I need to do to hit that bullseye? And then how does this console help me get to that result? I think that's kind of the mindset that's been super helpful.
Yeah. There's some people, I mean, especially with our audience who are serving in churches who don't have access to studios, right? They can't really go in and like A/B test a bunch of stuff. They can't move a mic around a bunch of times. They probably, they wouldn't even have the education or the background to know where to start. But one of the most popular kind of things that a lot of audio engineers say is, using reference tracks, or, think about what a good acoustic guitar sounds like, and, use that as kind of your backbone for how close you can get it to match up. With this day and age, with streaming and with the amount of songs we have at our fingertips, what would you say is some best practice or guidance for people who are looking to kind of get that maybe standard in their mind or their ears? Where would you encourage them to start looking for that kind of stuff? Or what genre should they listen to?
That's a good question. I really think that, things have changed a little bit over the last generation. I don't know how far back, but, listening to music used to be a very intentional pursuit, right? You would set up your record player in your listening environment, and you would have to really be intentional about not only to listen in the first place, but what you wanted to listen to. And now we're at a point where we're surrounded by music all the time. Mm-hmm. In environments where we walk around, coffee shops and shopping, but also in our cars and the earbuds, that everybody has in their ears all the time. And, background music has just become a part of our life in a way that I think isn't what it used to be. And so I would say for somebody who's trying to really be intentional about it, I would say let's set aside some time for intentional listening. So this isn't just, I'm going to listen to music that I like and what makes me feel good. This is like with the intention of learning. So it really is focused listening. And I would say for that, the highest quality version of a song you can get. So whether that's, you pay a little extra for Apple Music's high-res version of the song, or you get Tidal or some of those other platforms who have high-res versions of the music. I know Amazon Music, if you have a Prime subscription, you can get their kind of HD version of their songs for not a whole lot of extra money. And it really does sound different. So I think getting the highest quality version of a song, and then having a listening environment that is knowable and predictable. So go ahead and invest in a good pair of headphones. Go ahead and maybe invest in a good pair of, bookshelf size studio monitors so that you can have the music coming at you in the highest possible fidelity. And then in terms of what to listen to, there are some kind of industry standard like PA tuning tracks and that kind of thing. But I think if you were to go and research like Grammy-winning titles for Best Engineered or Best Mixed Album, that'd be a good place to start. And that could be from this year, it could be from the 90s, it could be from the 70s. It doesn't really matter. Obviously, styles change, but the attention to detail and the fidelity that you'll hear applies across all genres and all eras, really, of music. And so, there are some things that I really like to listen to for those aspects. For example, if you're really wanting to dial in the sound of an acoustic guitar, go to somebody who's a great acoustic guitar player and is famous for it. I mean, listen to James Taylor, listen to Bonnie Raitt, listen to, all the people who we know, not just a worship leader banging out the right chords on an acoustic guitar, but somebody who is an excellent guitar player. If you're gonna listen to Christian music in that way, go to somebody like Stephen Curtis Chapman, who's a great guitar player. And, he did a bluegrass album a couple years ago. Those tones are amazing, and the same with drums. Like, there's so many different styles of drumming. Don't necessarily box yourself into, Bethel or Hillsong or Passion worship drums. Go ahead and listen to, Grammy-winning pop records that have a different drum sound than you may want in your band, maybe different than your band's even capable of. But it would help you develop a library of, okay, that snare drum sound from that song versus this snare drum sound. Like, how's that different? Well, it's darker, it's deeper. This one's brighter, this is more pingy. Like, what is it about the drum that makes that sound that way? What is it about the playing that makes it sound that way? And what could I do to maybe try to replicate some of those things? Is it darker because of the drum, or is it darker because of EQ? There's really no way to know on a recording, but you're developing sort of this Rolodex of tones that you can maybe try to get back to. And then as it applies to your environment and your console, most people now, unless you're in a completely analog environment, most people have the ability to do virtual sound check. I think virtual sound check for a live audio engineer has been the greatest invention in our generation.
Amen.
Being able to capture the sound of your instruments in your context and go back offline, outside of the heat of the moment, and really practice. To go, okay, if I solo in place this snare drum, does that even sound good? Like,
right.
What is that microphone actually hearing? And how could I experiment to make it sound better? I want people to get things as right as possible at the microphone so that their mixing console is really just to kind of find the art and add the spice. It's not to surgically repair a bad source. Mm-hmm. Because if the source is right and it sounds good the way it's captured at the microphone, it's like, if it sounds good on headphones and it sounds horrible in the PA, then maybe you've got a problem with your PA. Or maybe you've got a problem in your room that you need to address with acoustics or some other kind of, maybe there's a reflection or a node that kind of takes off in terms of feedback in your room. That's a problem that's independent of what the band is doing. So find ways to make sure that what the microphone is capturing is the best possible sound, and then figuring out how does that translate to the PA. And if the source itself is not good, either based on the microphone or the player, then maybe that's a different conversation. But I think if we're talking about drums, for example, there might be a way to just get you and your drummer to hang out on a Wednesday evening or a Saturday morning or whenever you can get kind of offline and just have him or her play, and you can experiment. Let's see what happens if we move this microphone an inch closer to the head, or what happens if we pull the kick mic away from the front head a little bit, or move it toward the beater head. Mm-hmm. Like how, there has to be time that's not a rehearsal, that's not a service, to be able to experiment a little bit, because that's the only way you can really challenge yourself and make things better. So, this is a bigger conversation about your rehearsal process and how you do a sound check and how you maintain your gear. And I mean, all these things are so important. But I think at the very, very, very beginning, to answer your question, have a strategic plan for how you listen to music in an intentional way. That doesn't mean that you don't ever have time that you just have music on and it's in the background and it's just fun. But set aside some time every week to listen to things for a specific reason. And don't think that just because you're mixing in church, you only need to listen to worship music. Most of the music I listen to is not worship music, because I'm trying to listen for the things that are really great about a particular recording. And I think starting with what the industry has determined as standard, like this is the best version of this song. The Grammy Association has voted for this thing and everybody agrees this song is awesome. What is it about that song that made them think that? And is there anything technically that stands out that goes, man, those drums have so much impact, or that vocal is just so clear, or that, the way they do their effects, like I would have never thought of having that much delay on something, or whatever it is. We can always learn from what the industry has said. This is the gold standard for this year. So that'd be my 2 cents on where to start.
It's really good. You mentioned earlier a little bit about kind of consoles and virtual soundcheck being one of the features and things that's I think readily available to most mixers these days that are digital. Kind of a personal question for you. When you have mixed on a ton of different desks. So you've used the Waves platform, Digico. You've just taught a series on the Allen and Heath SQ7. You've mentioned Yamaha. My question for you is, over the years of mixing and kind of jumping from platform to platform, do you see any trends right now that mixers are prioritizing, or that or that are kind of maybe changing the game a little bit? Because one of the things that the place where I'm asking this question from, churches, when we talk to churches and they're talking about a console or upgrading their console at some level, there's a little bit of fear with how fast technology changes. Am I going to buy this mixer and 3 years from now it's going to be obsolete and there's going to be some big new thing that is going to change the game, and our console's no longer going to do what we need to do for church services? And just from your experience, having been kind of from platform to platform and seen, a couple of good cycles of maybe style, and I don't know, like cars do refreshes every couple of years and they remake the models and things. Anything that you're seeing in terms of trends with mixers that I think churches should be aware of?
Man, that's a good question. I think consoles have gotten so much better, especially in the smaller form factor, lower price point version. I think for a long time, the biggest reason that the X32 became sort of the standard for small churches is because it was affordable, it was compact, it was easy to get around on. It was like there were so many things that were kind of a game changer for that particular console in the way that it impacted the small format digital console market. Now, I think other manufacturers have seen that and have really kind of collectively raised the bar for that type of console across the industry. So I think Allen and Heath is a good example with their SQ series. It's very easy to use, very simple to understand and get a hold of. Yamaha just came out with the DM7, which is kind of game changer as well. And I think the thing about those two particular brands is that they, and others, I mean, Digico has done this too, but they have really stepped up the way the console does the math. Computer processing has gotten so much better since the advent of the X32, for example, that the way particularly FPGA processing happens and the way the signal gets through the console and in and out of the console in terms of its bus structure and all that, the math has gotten so much better and processors have gotten so much faster that the depth of quality can be so much better. The fact that Allen and Heath consoles are 96K out of the box throughout their whole product line is massive. The way they're doing their conversion and the quality of the digital to analog converters, it's phenomenal the way it's gotten so much better. So I think at that point, then you're just basing your choices on I/O count. So, as far as advice, I would say, get more I/O than you think you need, because if you say, man, I'm fine with 32 channels, and so you get one that's limited to that, and your stage rack can't accommodate any more than 32 inputs, and then you decide you want to do something big for next Christmas, and you're kind of out of luck because you're limited. Yep. I think, as much as you can afford, really kind of plan for the future in terms of I/O. So after you get the I/O needs sorted, I think really ergonomics and workflow are kind of the next big decision. So for example, do you want your EQ laid out vertically or horizontally? Is there a manufacturer that you admire the way it's laid out, that, the knobs are closer together than this console is? Or, one thing that console manufacturers have done, which is great, is they've opened up the kind of user definability of certain things. So you can lay out faders in any way that makes sense for you. So channel 1 doesn't necessarily have to always be fader 1. That fader could represent channel 37 if that's right where you need it to live in terms of your preferred workflow. So make sure to choose a console that has that kind of flexibility. And then, other than ergonomics, it's things like, are there any plugins or processing that's built in that you could take advantage of that could provide you different colors to paint with than what's just the standard EQ or compression? So are there any built-in, compressors that are kind of outside the normal channel strip compressor? And how much does that kind of make a difference in terms of how you want to process your bass guitar or your vocal? And, again, that comes down to just available DSP and how many voices or how many channels each of these things are available to in a particular desk. So I think in general, it's a great time to sort of be in the market for a mixing console, because there are a lot more viable options than there used to be. And I think manufacturers really do care about serving smaller environments better. They're not just about the big sort of A-class touring level 300 input console anymore. They really do have great options for people who are working with smaller budgets and smaller needs. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the trends we have been watching is it seems like the plug-in world, or the studio world, some might call it, is coming closer and closer to live, and there's always latency, right? That's the biggest, I think, factor to be aware of, is latency with plugins. But even, I can't remember the brand off the top of my head. Somebody will read me in the comments for it. But there is a brand that just made essentially a Waves processor, but for every plugin, right? They opened it up to not just Waves plugins, and you can patch it into your rack. You can run it with your console. And so it feels
so that's
like
called Fourier Audio. And they're, basically anything that runs VST can run on their platform. And it's a very, very powerful processor. And it's really, it's really cool. I think it's going to be a bit of a game changer. I think, Waves is still making great products too. And so I think, a lot of the Waves plugins are zero latency. Yeah. And if you're in an environment like the Waves LV1, then you do have delay compensation that can account for all of that latency and make it in time. The trouble with latency is when you're going out of the console with some channels to process in Waves, and then coming back and combining them with channels that aren't going out and back. That's where they're going to be out of time. So, there are ways to manually compensate for some of that latency. But yeah, that's a huge thing to be aware of, is latency in general. But I think to your point about plugins that you would use in a studio environment coming into live and being more and more viable, that is definitely a trend and definitely true. I think, and it's a great resource for engineers. It's a great tool to have.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said before, I would treat them more as, an additional spice rather than the whole recipe. I think, especially if you're getting into using plugins as a newbie, you can dip your toe in the water and be really effective and really safe. I think if you dive in, it's pretty easy to get in over your head. So, tread lightly, but there's no reason not to experiment with it, because it does open up the palette for a lot more colors to paint with. And so that's a good thing.
That's good. My last question for you that I just personally have wondered, again, from your experience and just your kind of, I would call it an in-depth experience, because you've taken some of these desks out on the road. You've been able to mix some of this stuff in churches and in live recordings. If you were to use the ingredients from, if we're using the baking or the cooking analogy, of EQ, compressor, preamp, master bus sound, like from different consoles, could you craft your dream console? Like if you could cherry pick, I want the preamps from Midas and I want the compressors from Avid and I want if you could create your favorite situation, do you have kind of a dream desk that you would mix at?
Man, like if it could be like a Frankenstein console?
Oh, 100%.
Oh, what a great question. Man. Gosh, I would probably start with I like the 32-bit mic pre's from Digico.
Yeah.
In terms of just the stock console EQ, I would go SSL.
Yeah.
I would still like to have Waves plugins, because there's some plugins there that are kind of indispensable to me.
What are those that come to mind? You can fill those in. Tell our audience what you would go to.
Oh man. Well, I love, obviously the CLA series of compressors. So, there's an 1176 and an LA2A, LA3A emulation, those things. In terms of effects, H reverb and H delay are kind of my go-tos, but then also the Abbey Road plates reverbs are awesome. In terms of other compressors, I love H comp.
Yeah.
And the API stuff, API EQ as well. Just the emulations of those classic studio console processors are just so good. Gosh.
Fader layout, like think about the desks that you've been at and, what faders have felt the best or even configuration.
Yeah, so fader layout, I would say Digico, but the fader itself, the actual physical fader motor, SSL.
Interesting.
It just feels really good. In terms of screen, I would take the Quantum series Digico, because their new HD screen is just awesome.
Big, bright, and beautiful.
Big, bright, and beautiful. And then
what about workflow? You think about like internal kind of as you navigate even GUI, how you would experience the processing.
Yeah, part of it is just muscle memory and habit. So these days for me it's Digico, but back in the day for sure it was the Avid profile. I think there are things that got into the Avid S6L from the profile workflow that are still really good. But for some reason, that profile, it was just the easiest console to patch and to lay out and to get around on. And the way they did scenes and snapshot stuff and scoping and all that, it was just so intuitive. It's great. So there's a lot of similarity in the newer Avid line that kind of harkens back to that, which is great. But again, for me, a lot of it is just muscle memory, and most of my muscle memory lately has been on Digico. But that's not to say that the other brands aren't great.
Yeah.
I think it's similar to PAs, right? I mean, D&B, L Acoustics, Meyer, Martin, like they've all got great products at the top of their product line. The same for consoles, right? It's just a matter of your personal preference and your workflow.
Yeah, I love that. I think I'll carry that question with me because I'm always interested to hear people's, experience and preferences on what they've used and what's been a good experience, and just kind of dreaming a little bit, even as we have served a number of different churches. We're in the Behringer ecosystem a little bit. We're in the Allen and Heath ecosystem a little bit. We're really starting. There's a ton of churches starting to get in the Waves emotion set up, and so we're really starting to spend a lot of time in there. And so I'm starting to feel very comfortable and kind of in my own little car engine, with the Wave system. So appreciate you sharing that insight.
That's what we upgraded to at my church when we were looking for something new. We had an M32 that we had outgrown, and we kind of dipped our toes in the water of the LV1 setup with Waves, and everybody has loved it. The volunteers have gotten up to speed really quickly. I think it sounds great. Yeah. I think the flexibility that you have with all the plug-in choices, it just gives you, like I said, different colors at your fingertips that can really make the mix impactful and effective.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, I have just so enjoyed chatting with you today, and want to give a shout out to MXU. Where can people find or learn more about the resources that you guys have available? Because honestly, the library at MXU is always growing. So you guys have stuff for mixing, about PAs, about lighting, about video. I mean, there's tons of stuff. Again, similar heart to what Churchfront is doing as well. But where can they find more out about the resources you have available?
Yeah. So as far as just kind of getting involved in our community, you can follow us on Instagram at MXU Rocks, and the MXU podcast is a great resource as well. It's obviously free, and great conversations with industry experts about all things production. And then as far as the MXU platform, if you go to getmxu.com, you can learn all about what we have to offer. It's a training resource for sure, but it's also a team resource. So as you're looking to build a volunteer team and, have tools to not just get them skilled up, but to manage them and to communicate with them and to build a healthy team, that's really a lot of what we're concerned with too. We want people to feel empowered to be able to recruit and train and retain a healthy volunteer team. So the library itself of training videos is over 700 videos now.
Jeez.
And we'll have over 1,000 within the coming months. And we're recording and editing content all the time. So we're really excited about how that's going to continue to grow. The great thing about MXU at this point is that you can try it for free. So if you go to getmxu.com, you can try it for free. You won't, you'll be locked out of certain features and you won't have access to the entire library, but you can certainly get a feel for what it's like. And subscribing is very easy and affordable. So depending on the size of your team, even the lowest subscription amount gets you access for up to 10 volunteers. So it's a great way to build, high quality training that's trustworthy, get it in your team's hands all the time. We have an iOS app now. So if you have an iPhone, you can take MXU with you wherever you go. So we're super excited about that as well.
I love it. Love what you guys are doing over there, and love the team there too. Lots of great folks working on putting those resources out. So thanks for all the hard work you guys do. And you guys didn't even mention, we didn't get to it today, but the workshops and things that you guys are doing these days are really cool opportunities. So check out the website, go down the rabbit hole of what they have to offer. And if you're in the area, man, a workshop would be awesome to attend with your team and get some hands-on in-person time.
Come see us in Knoxville. Even if we don't have a workshop, come say hi in Knoxville. We'd love to meet people and show you around. It's awesome.
That'd be awesome. Thanks, Jeff, so much for being on the show today. We really appreciate it. And I hope to have you back sometime to go down some other rabbit trails we didn't get to today.
That'd be a pleasure. Let's do it. Thanks, Luke.